process. Now, in a previous negotiation video, I talked about the importance of negotiating process before you dive into substance. If substance is everything that goes into the deal terms, the offers and the counteroffers we make, if that's the substance of the negotiation, the process is everything that gets us from wherever we are today to the end goal, to the finish line. Now, when we talk about negotiating process, I think of negotiations to the bare minimum in every negotiation, but you want to try and move up the ladder and try to achieve all three of these as you negotiate process. At the lowest level, what we're trying to do as negotiators is get clarity on process. So you want to make sure that early on in the conversation, early on in the negotiation, there's a discussion about how are we going to navigate this negotiation together. You might ask questions like, how long does it take an organization like yours to do a deal like this? What are some things that might make things go smoothly, and what are some factors that might arise that might slow things down? Who are all the parties that need to be involved for this deal to be successful? That's getting clarity on process. One step above that is commitment. You don't simply want clarity on how people are thinking about the process, what their plans are, etc. To the extent possible, you want some level of commitment. You want some assurance that the process is actually going to be followed. What you don't want is to start going down this path with the other party, and all of a sudden things start changing. And things start changing in a way that are actually disadvantageous to you. Depending on the kind of leverage you have, you might be able to get stronger or weaker forms of commitment. Even an assurance is some form of commitment. A promise is a commitment. A handshake is a commitment. But then there's also commitment that can be written down on a piece of paper. There can be contractual commitment. To the extent that you're worried that the process will not be followed as stipulated, you might want to try to get some level of commitment. At the highest level of negotiating process, above clarity and above commitment, is when you have the opportunity to change the process itself. If they're reporting to you that this deal is going to take 6 months, but 3 months would be better for you, or 9 months would be better for you, negotiating the process itself and trying to get it to change in the direction you want it to be is even more advantageous than simply getting clarity or commitment. Or they might be thinking that the process is going to involve a certain set of people, but you want to make sure others are involved, or that some people that they want involved are not involved. That would again be you negotiating process and trying to get a change in the process that's been set by them or that's been set by default. When you step back and you think of the negotiation process as an important and integral part of what your job is as a negotiator, then you can break it down into these 3 levels. In every negotiation, I want to get, to the extent possible, clarity on what the process is. What am I getting into? To the extent possible, you want to get commitment. How do we make sure the rules of the game don't change halfway through the game? And finally, if I don't like the rules of the game, can I change them? And the more leverage you have, the more opportunities you have to actually get changes to the process. Good luck.
In this particular video, I want to talk about concession making. And specifically, I want to give you 3 tips when it comes to making concessions. At some point in your negotiations, there's going to have to be some give and take. Both sides are going to have to move away from their opening positions, and you're going to have to decide whether, when, and how to make concessions. Here's 3 tips to keep in mind. First, if you have a certain amount of wiggle room, a certain amount of concessions that you can make, typically, assuming there's going to be some give and take farther along in the process as well, you don't want to give away everything at the same time. And as you decide to partition the concessions you can make into smaller chunks, what you want to do usually is to make sure that the concessions you make get smaller in size as time goes on. And here's why. If you have $100 worth of value that you can give to the other side in concessions, and the first time around you give them $25, then you give them another $25, another $25, and a fourth $25 chunk. What happens now? Well, now they've been accustomed to getting another $25 every time they push, and they're expecting another set of dollars sitting around that you can give them. You haven't really gotten them used to the idea that there's only so much to give. If instead you give a $40 concession, then a $25 concession, a $15 concession, a $5 concession, now what's happening over time is that you're managing their expectations. As time goes on, they're getting the signal from you, which is an accurate signal, that there's not as much wiggle room left. If you make sure that your concessions are diminishing in size as time goes on, you're much more likely to manage the other side's expectations about when there's going to be not anything left to give. The second tip when making concessions, in addition to making diminishing concessions, is to make sure you don't give too many concessions that are unreciprocated. There's nothing wrong with giving something away first. But if you're the only one making concessions, and every time they push, you're the one who's lowering your demands or offering up more value, then you might create the frame, you might create the expectation that you're desperate, or that you're going to do anything it takes to get the deal done. Typically what you want to do, even if you're the one starting, you're the party that's starting to make concessions, is you want to encourage the other side to reciprocate those. If you give a concession, maybe even two concessions that were unreciprocated, at some point very soon after that you want to draw the line. And the sooner you draw the line, the more likely they will get the message, they'll get the signal that if they want more from you, they need to also come up with ways to reward you for your flexibility. Third tip, when you're making concessions, especially when there's very little trust, or you're not quite sure whether the other side is going to reciprocate the concessions you're going to make, or you're worried that they're going to see you as desperate or weak or naive for making concessions, what you can do is make contingent concessions. A contingent concession basically signals to the other side that yes, there's flexibility on our side, but it's contingent upon movement from your side as well. So instead of offering a concession, what you say is, we can move on X if you can move on Y. Or when we get to this point, we're going to be able to make this concession. Or under the following conditions, we'd be able to do this. And what that does is it allows you to signal your willingness to move, but it doesn't give anything away for free. So when you do all three of these things, when you get into the habit, usually, of making concessions that diminish in size, when you get into the habit of making sure you're not making too many unreciprocated concessions, typically you want to draw the line at 1. You might make a concession, but you also want to let them know after that that you're not going to negotiate against yourself. And third, you want to have in your back pocket the ability to make contingent concessions. When you do all three of those things, you make it much more likely that the back and forth is productive, it's fair, and you finally get to a deal that both of you can live with. Good luck. If I talk about one key insight, a principle, a tactic, an approach that will hopefully help you as you navigate your own deals and disputes. In this video, I want to talk about a hidden source of leverage that you have in many negotiations, but you might not have recognized. And that source of leverage, that asset, is closure. The mere fact that you are willing to close the deal can be used as a source of leverage in negotiations. For example, you're negotiating a job offer, and you've asked for a number of things, there's been some give and take, it's been cordial, but there's certain things that you're still hoping to get that you just haven't been able to get the other side to agree to. Well, one of the things that you can do in a negotiation to make it more likely that the other side says yes to a concession you're asking for is to assure them that after this particular need is met, there will not be any more negotiations. This gets the deal done. After this, no more. Because if you're going to ask the other side, whether it's your hiring manager, whether it's the person you're going to be reporting to, whether it's somebody in HR, what they don't want to do is run around, use a lot of political capital in their organization, try to get you the things that you want in this negotiation, only to find out that you still ended up taking a job elsewhere. So when you let somebody know that this gets the deal done, they are now much more willing to fight for that concession because they know in return you're going to be saying yes. Something similar happens in negotiations of all kinds. Too often there's concessions that the other side will not give you until the last day. And by last day, I mean if they are sure that this gets the deal done, they might be willing to put more value on the table. Because on that day, what you're giving them in exchange is closure. What you're telling them is that I really was interested in getting the deal done. No, I'm not just using the offers that you're making and the concessions that you're making to me in order to sweeten another deal with one of your competitors. I'm not just taking what you're giving me and shopping it around. So certain concessions the other side is hesitant to give you because there's not enough trust or because there's just not enough confidence that the deal is ever going to get done. And so they don't want to do certain things while the risk of no deal is still looming large. The moment you're able to put on the table, if we can do A, B, and C, or if we can do X, the deal is done and we will sign, or we're not going to shop it around anymore, all of a sudden, they now have an incentive to put that on the table. So when you think about this element, closure, the ability to say to the other person, the other side, this and no more, that in itself is a source of leverage in negotiation. And when used appropriately, when used at the right time, it can not only help get the deal done, it can help you attract more value for yourself right before the deal does close. Good luck. Hi. In this video, what I want to talk about is the problem with being too focused on one kind of question in negotiations. In my experience, too often the conversation that people have in their negotiations is about what. What do you want? What do we want? And that back and forth often is not ideal. Because what ends up happening is people are stuck talking about their demands and their positions. Here are the things that I want, here are the things that you want, and often it's hard to reconcile things where we want very different outcomes. There are three questions that don't get enough attention. Why, how, and when. When you shift the conversation from what to why, you're digging deeper. You're going past what people want to try to understand why they want these things. In a separate video, I talked about the difference between negotiating positions and negotiating interests. That's the difference between negotiating what and negotiating why. Changing the conversation from what people are demanding of you to trying to understand what is the underlying problem they're trying to solve. What are their underlying needs? What's bringing them to the table today? Why do they need this certain thing? When you shift from what to why, you make it more likely that you find ways of resolving their underlying problem, which allows them to be flexible on what they're demanding. The second kind of question that doesn't get enough is how. Instead of just talking about what people want, try to discover how things work in their organization, on their side, or how they're seeing the situation. So instead of talking about what each side wants or what their demands are or what your demands are, shifting the conversation to how allows you to explore better the inner workings of their mind, the inner workings of their organization, or the inner workings of their stakeholder group that's making these demands in the first place. Finally, shifting the conversation from what to when. Too often, certain things are not possible in the here and now, but they might be possible in the future. They might be possible under different conditions. So instead of getting stuck on what each side wants and finding that there is no way to move forward, that you're completely deadlocked, shifting the conversation to when might things be possible? When might constraints be lifted? When might there be more flexibility? When might other parties be more accommodating to allow this negotiation to move forward can be a way of having a more fruitful conversation. Unfortunately, too often, especially less experienced negotiators, find themselves stuck on what each side wants. When you also start to explore the why, the how, and the when, it's much more likely that you're going to find a way forward that gets you to a deal, to an agreement, to an understanding that is of value to both sides. Good luck. Hi, in this video, I want to talk about a difficult situation we often find ourselves in. When we're tempted to lie in a negotiation because we think that telling the truth will be costly. Well, a lot of people I know want to be as ethical as possible in all of their dealings, even when a lot of money is on the line. But they worry about this trade-off. If I'm too honest, if I don't lie, I might lose my shirt at the negotiation table. So in our book, Negotiation Genius, we have a chapter entirely devoted to lies and deception. And one section of that Max and I use to talk about smart alternatives to lying in negotiation. Things that you can do when you're tempted to lie, but you know it would go against your ethical standards. You don't want to say anything that's untrue, but you also want to make sure you're protected financially or strategically in the negotiation. So what can you do when somebody asks you a question that tempts you to be untruthful? First option, instead of answering the question they've asked, offer to answer a related question that would maybe be of some value to you, and to do it openly and honestly. So for example, if somebody asks you, how much does it cost to make this product that you're selling? And you don't want to reveal that because you think if you reveal that information, they're going to use it against you in the negotiation by offering you the least amount of money possible. Well, instead of answering truthfully or untruthfully, you can say, listen, that's not information that we can share with you, but I can understand or appreciate why you'd want to ask. You want to make sure that what you're paying for this product, what you're paying for this service is worth it. So instead of telling you what the cost structure is, which I can't reveal. How about instead I tell you a little bit more about how we make these products and what kind of quality standards we have and what the process for this is. And hopefully that gives you the comfort you're looking for. So you've openly and honestly answered a related question that is hopefully of value to you, but you're comfortable sharing the information. Second option, you can say to someone, listen, we can't answer that question at this stage in the negotiation. For example, if you're negotiating a potential partnership or an M&A deal and they want to know certain information, it's not uncommon to say certain information we can reveal up front, but other information only comes later in the due diligence process. When we are more comfortable, when we are more sure that this process is a legitimate process, that we're actually trying to make headway towards a final deal that would work for both of us. So information you can't reveal at a certain time in a negotiation, you may offer to reveal to them at a later stage in the negotiation when you are more comfortable, when there's more trust, etc. A third option for how to respond to a difficult question where there's a temptation to lie but you want to be open and honest and ethical is to make a trade, where you say, I'm willing to give you that information you need if in exchange you're willing to provide us with the following information that we need. Or you might ask for a different concession. If you want this information, we can certainly do that, but first we need an assurance that we are agreed to the following elements of the negotiation. For example, if you want to know my cost structure, before we do that, why don't we first agree to what margin we are going to get in this deal? So once we give you the cost, we no longer have to worry about whether you're going to squeeze us because we've already agreed to a 10% margin or 15% margin or a 20% profit margin. That way you can reveal the information, but you're protected because they've made a concession or made an agreement in advance. When you do these three things, it just allows you more ability to balance this trade-off between wanting to be open and honest, but also wanting to make sure you get a good enough deal or a great deal in negotiations. When you offer to openly and honestly answer a different question that perhaps is not ideally what they want to know about, but is of some value to them, when you tell them that you can provide the information at a later stage in the negotiation, or when you can ask for something in return, all of these are ways to make sure that you're open, honest, ethical, but without losing value in the negotiation. Good luck. In this video, I want to talk about one way to balance firmness when it comes to negotiation and flexibility in negotiation. And here's the situation I'm envisioning. You walk into a negotiation and often you know what it is that you want, but you might have very little visibility over what it is that they can give and can't give, where they have more and fewer constraints, where they can be flexible and where they can't. In a situation like that, it's dangerous to guess, but that is exactly what we end up doing when we walk into a negotiation and propose a deal with a following deal structure, where we say something like, here's the price we want, here are the terms we want, and here's the closing date we want, etc. In a situation like that, a more effective strategy often is to give people a menu of options. Instead of just making one proposal, we often advise our students, and I often advise my client, instead of just making one proposal, make 2 or 3 different proposals that are all equally valuable to you, but which have different deal structures. So one might give you more in price, the other might give you a little bit more in exclusivity terms. One deal might be better for you because it's an earlier closing date, which you happen to prefer. The other one relaxes that demand, but in exchange asks for a little bit more in some other aspect of the deal. When you propose multiple offers that are equally valuable to you, you increase the odds that you have made a proposal that the other side can live with as well. The thing that I always tell my students is to keep in mind, the more currencies you allow the other side to pay you in, the more likely it is that you get paid. So what I'm basically suggesting is that you be as firm as necessary, as stubborn as reasonable when it comes to the total value of the deal that it is you're demanding. At the same time, you want to be as flexible as possible when it comes to deal structure. So you're being stubborn when it comes to the value you think you deserve, but you're being flexible when it comes to how that deal is structured so that it can accommodate their legitimate constraints as well. Another way to think about this is when I'm in a negotiation, when I'm in a dispute, especially when there is some sort of deadlock, when we're just not making progress, the signal I'm often trying to send to the other side is the following. I know where I need to get. I'm flexible on how we get there. In other words, I know what I need to take home. I know the value of the deal that I think we deserve. But beyond that, I'm going to work with you to the extent possible to make sure it works for you as well. I know where I need to get, but I'm completely flexible on how we get there. And when you show that level of flexibility, it not only eases the tension, it not only shows some respect, you're respecting their legitimate constraints, it also just makes it more likely that you two, the two sides, will find a way to do this deal that gives you what you need, but allows them to do it in a way that's possible for them. Good luck. In this negotiation video, I want to talk about one of the earliest pieces of advice I give to students in my class, or often end up giving to my clients when we're involved in negotiations. And the advice is this: never let your offer speak for itself. Always tell the story that goes with it. Now, what does that mean? When you're making an offer or you're making a proposal, what you don't want to do is say something like, we are asking for X, or we would like you to pay us $10 million, or we would like the following exclusivity terms, or we would like the closing date to be the following. You don't want to leave it at that. You always want to follow up your offer or your proposal or your request with the justification that makes clear to them why you think this is fair, why you think this is appropriate, why you think this is the legitimate way to handle this aspect of the negotiation. If you don't do that, if you just let your number sit there or your proposal sit there, not framed with a justification, it's very easy to dismiss. It's very easy to dismiss a number and for them to then just throw out their own number. And now you're stuck going back and forth. Now that's not what you want your negotiations to devolve into. You don't want it to be your number followed by their number, followed by a revised number by you, followed by a revised number for them, and then just meeting somewhere arbitrarily in the middle. Rather, what you want to do is to make sure that they have to engage with your way of thinking about the negotiation, the frame that you're creating for the negotiation. When you follow up your offers with the justification, with the framing, with the narrative that explains why this is the right way to think about it, and hence this is the right way to solve this problem, it makes it much more likely that the negotiation moves in a trajectory that ends up with you getting the kind of offer or deal that you think is fair and appropriate. When you start the negotiation on the right foot, you do so by making sure your offers and your proposals are always contextualized in a framing, in a justification, in a narrative that helps the other side understand not just what you want, but why you want it and how you're seeing the situation. And when you start to control the frame of a negotiation, it's much more likely that you achieve your objectives. Good luck. In this session, I want to talk about surprises. In my experience, while there's no hard and fast rule, in my experience, surprises are rarely good in negotiations. It usually doesn't work out too well for you when you surprise the other side with your approach, with your proposal, or with your offer. If they're surprised, if they didn't see it coming, they're less likely to be prepared to engage with you, to respond productively to the offer or the proposal you've made. They're less likely to be able to think creatively with you or think differently than they did when they first walked into the room. It's also possible that when you surprise the other side, they might get upset. They might think that you're trying to bully them or you're trying to disrespect them. Rather, if you want to make a proposal or you want to come with an offer that might be shocking to them, that might be more aggressive than they would otherwise expect, or it's an approach that you want them to consider that's very different than the way they've done things previously, here's a few things you'd probably be better off doing. First, you want to manage expectations. You want to make sure that when somebody's walking into a negotiation, they know what to expect. They know what's going to be discussed, broadly speaking, how the negotiation or the conversation or discussion is going to go, what's going to be covered and what might not be covered. Second, if your proposal or your offer is going to be something pretty surprising or very aggressive or much more aggressive than they might otherwise expect, you might want to preview it with them in broad brushstrokes, in outline form. Let them know the kind of thing you're going to be proposing in more detail when you meet face to face. Third, you might want to pre-test your argument. If you're going to come at the negotiation in a unique way, in a different way, in a way that others are not used to seeing, you might want to pre-test that argument with some of the stakeholders that are relevant to that negotiation. See how it goes over. See what goes over well and what does not go over well, detail so you can refine it before the actual substantive negotiations on the topic. And finally, if you can't do any of those, if there's nothing you can do but surprise them, if they are going to be shocked, if they're going to be taken aback, then when you make proposals or when you make an argument or when you take a certain approach that has that consequence, you want to make sure that you approach the negotiation in a way that respects the fact that they might not be ready to engage productively with you in this case. What that means is you might start the negotiation by being honest about it. Might let them know that this is something that you're going to propose that you understand they may not be ready to discuss. That you're going to propose something that is quite different than the way they've done things normally. And then suggest to them that they take more time and think about it and come back to you perhaps at a later date. Now, none of these, as I said, are hard and fast rules. Of course, we can think of situations where surprising the other side might be a useful element in your strategy. But too often, people walk into a negotiation, surprise or shock the other side, only to find that both parties lose. What I want to talk about is prioritizing your needs and prioritizing your asks when you make them to the other side. Too often, we let the other side know the number of things that we want. We want A, B, C, and D. But we don't give them enough clarity on which of these are important to us and which of these are not as important. Now, we don't do that understandably because we don't want them to hold anything hostage that we really value. If they know that we really want A, will they find a way to hold it hostage or demand more in concessions? That's possible. But there's a risk when we don't give them enough information about what is more and less important to us. For example, you're in a negotiation and you've asked for A, B, C, and D. A and B really matter to you. C and D don't matter as much. They come back to you and it turns out that they can be flexible on C and D, and they offer these to you. Now they feel like they've met you halfway, but from your perspective, you've gotten almost nothing of value relative to what you really asked for altogether. So the problem is when you don't let the other side know what's more and less important to you, it's often the case that you find yourself with the process being disruptive when the other side doesn't quite know what to fight for, how hard to fight for it, what to bring to you, and what to expect in return. So a wiser way to manage this tension of not wanting to give away so much information that they can use it against you, but at the same time making sure that they know what to fight for and what to expect if they make you certain concessions and what they can expect if they've given you too little in value, is to let people know what your priorities are. You don't have to say A is worth $10 million to me, whereas C and D are only worth $10,000 to me, but you can let people know. Obviously, there's a number of things we'd like to be different in the deal and the terms that you've proposed. Specifically, we would like A, B, C, and D. And to be clear, A and B are more important to us, relatively speaking, and C and D are important, but are not of the same level of importance. When you let the other side know that, you're less likely to fall into a situation where the other side gives you what you value least and still expects you to reciprocate heavily because they think they've met you halfway. Now they know where to put their attention, where to put their resources, and how not to expect too much from you if they don't deliver. Good luck. In this session, I want to talk about the problem with optimizing for getting to yes. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to get a deal done. There's certainly nothing wrong with wanting to reach an agreement if reaching an agreement means value is created for both sides. And yet there's a problem when you optimize one-dimensionally for closing as many deals as you can, for getting to yes every single time. And this is perhaps best illustrated in a little quip that my friend Max Bazerman, again, co-author of Negotiation Genius, often uses. What he often tells his students and his clients is, if you've never missed a flight in your life, you're probably getting to the airport too early. Now think about that. Nobody wants to miss a flight. But if you've gotten to the airport 1,000 times in a row, early enough to never have missed a single one, you might be wasting a lot of time at airports. Now, if you're in sales, if you want to maximize the likelihood that somebody says yes to the deal, that's easy. If that's all you care about is closing the deal, then what you should do is offer your product or your service at the lowest possible price. Offer it at cost. Heck, offer it lower than cost. Offer it for nothing. I guarantee you will close the deal. But we know that's not what we really want to be doing. What we really want to be doing is optimizing for the portfolio of deals that we have. We want to make sure that when we go through all of the sales we've had or go through all of the deals we're negotiating, we end up in the right place. Unfortunately, negotiators sometimes in that moment of negotiation, when there's a deal to be made and it's at the table, you're sitting across from the other side, we sort of lose sight of the portfolio strategy and we start narrowly focusing on doing whatever it takes to get the deal done. And as my colleague Max often reminds people, if you're in sales and your margins right now are 5%, you have to ask yourself the question, if I doubled my margins tomorrow, if I decided not to do a single deal below 10% margin, would I really lose half my business? And if the answer is no, you'd be better off holding the line at 10% than at 5%. Because in the portfolio of deals, what you're going to find is you're going to have more no deals than you had before, but you're going to be making more money overall. So as we step back, the problem here is not wanting to get a deal or wanting to create value every chance you get or to get to yes in any one deal. There's nothing wrong with that when we look at it narrowly as one deal. But if your approach to negotiations is such that you cannot stomach a no deal, if you are so risk averse that you're just not willing to do or say anything or ask for anything that might lead to a no deal, there's a good chance in the portfolio of negotiations you're doing in your life or in your business, you're probably not optimizing. And so it's a reminder that every once in a while we want to audit our own approach. Are we too risk averse? Are we censoring ourselves too much for making a certain ask? Are we not drawing the line aggressively enough? And at the very least, we might want to experiment with that a little bit and check whether or not we are so focused on getting to yes in every deal that we're losing value overall in our portfolio of negotiations. Good luck. In this clip, I want to talk about the situation that happens often in negotiations where you're not negotiating with the final decision maker, or the person you're negotiating with isn't the only decision maker on the issue. Anytime you find yourself in a situation like that, the advice I give to my clients and to my students is always make sure at the end of the negotiation you've asked yourself one simple question. Have I made this person an effective ambassador of my message? So when I'm no longer there, are they going to be able to convey my proposal, my framing of the situation, my message as effectively as if I had been there myself? How do you do that? Well, the habit that I've cultivated is at the end of every important negotiation, I make sure that I reiterate the 1, 2, or 3 most important components of my proposal or of my message, so that when they're walking out of the room, I'm ensuring that what's ringing in their ears, what's the most important aspect that they remember from the meeting, is the thing that I want them most to remember. Because otherwise, what often happens is when they leave the room and they run into their boss, maybe in the hallway an hour later or a day later, they need to convey to their team what happened in that negotiation, the things that they remember as being most salient might not actually be the most important from my point of view. Maybe they end up remembering what we talked about last. Maybe they end up remembering what we spent most of our time on. And those things might not be the most important components of the message I would like to convey. So at the end of every meeting, I always make sure to ask myself, have I made this person an effective ambassador of my message? So that when they are there with their partners, their colleagues, their coworkers, or their boss, and I am not there, that when somebody asks them the question, what was that meeting all about? What did he want? What was he proposing? What happened? That what comes out of their mouth is consistent with the message that I would have liked to convey. Now, there's lots of other things that can go wrong. They might not want to convey certain aspects of the message. There might be incentive problems. There might be other things that get in the way of there being a clean transmission of my proposal or my message to these other parties. But what I don't want to get in the way of things is that the ambassador themselves was not fully equipped, didn't know the key talking points from my point of view. When you end every negotiation reiterating the things that you think are most important, you minimize the likelihood that things go wrong downstream. Good luck. Here I want to talk about one of the first things I do when I'm advising on a deal. When a client brings me in or a student walks into my office and we're talking about a complex negotiation, a difficult negotiation, usually one of the first things I'm going to do is clear up a whiteboard and draw out the negotiation space. Now, what's the negotiation space? It's just my term for all the parties that are relevant to this negotiation. Before we start talking about what we're going to do in this negotiation, what we're going to say, what we're going to aim for, how we're going to make our arguments, what kind of information we need, how we're going to frame things, any of that, before we get into any of those discussions, anything on the substance of the negotiation, the first thing I'll always ask my client to do is help me draw out the negotiation space. So we'll take a whiteboard and we'll literally map out all of the parties that are relevant to the negotiation. And by relevant, I mean one of two things. Who are all the parties that can somehow influence the negotiation or are somehow influenced by the negotiation? I want to keep my eye on every one of those parties. Anyone who can influence the deal or dispute or is influenced by the deal or dispute needs to be on our radar. And we'll map them out because as we think about our negotiation strategy, we want to take into account all of these parties' interests, constraints, alternatives, and perspectives. A lot of the action that takes place in the negotiation and the margin of success and failure often isn't determined by what happens when you walk into the room and the other side is sitting across from you. A lot of what your strategy depends on and success and failure depends on is how well you took into account the actions and the perspectives and the moves that parties that are not even in the room might make as a consequence of this negotiation taking place. When you make sure that your strategy is robust to the interests, constraints, alternatives, and perspectives of all the parties, not just the people that will be in the room, you make it much more likely that you actually achieve your objectives. Very often, what seemed like a great idea when looking narrowly at the negotiation table, looking narrowly at the set of parties that are clearly relevant to the negotiation, too often when we broadened our scope, we discovered that that strategy perhaps would not be wise, would not be ideal, given all of these other parties and the perspectives and the interests that they have in the negotiation. So when you zoom out and you broaden your scope, when you look at the negotiation space in its entirety, you're much more likely to come up with a strategy that's going to be more effective. Good luck. Hi. I want to talk about something that I've observed in meetings that I think is actually quite pernicious. Think about a strategy meeting, thinking about a board meeting, think about any situation where a group of people have been brought together to solve some problem. And in the room, there's a number of people sitting around the table, and one of those people is the boss, or the leader, or the person with the highest status. And here's what I often observe. When the leader speaks, when the person with the highest status speaks, when the boss speaks, they usually look around the whole table as they share their ideas. As they're talking, they make eye contact with a lot of different people. But that's not what anybody else in the room does when they speak. When somebody else in the room speaks, they're spending most of their time looking at the boss. They're trying to make sure that what they're saying is going over well with the boss, that the boss is nodding along, that they're coming across as competent, that if the boss wants to move in a certain direction, they're on the right side of it. And that is a particularly dangerous thing to do in organizations where you're interested in solving real problems. The advice I always give to leaders is make sure you don't create a culture. Make sure you don't create an environment in your meetings and in your organization where you are seen as someone who rewards people for coming up with the right solution. You don't want to reward people for coming up with the right solution or the right answer. Rather, what you want to do is reward people for coming up with good arguments. Because if the meeting that you've called is at all important, it's probably because you're dealing with a problem that's very complex. The way forward is unclear. There's a lot of uncertainty. That's why the meeting is taking place in the first place. That's the reason you have 5 or 10 people in the room. And it is highly unlikely that one person in the room happens to have the right answer ready to go and they just need to share it. More likely, the way forward is going to be a composite of a lot of different ideas from a lot of different people. It's going to take a lot of different points of view and perspectives and pros and cons and arguments from different people coming together in order to create a strategy that perhaps is more similar to what somebody in the room had originally said, but is still a refined version of it. Now, the mistake we make is that we create these cultures in subtle ways. If you end your meeting by saying things like, I think Julie had it right from the beginning, or I think we should go with Rob's idea, you've made a huge mistake because you've shown everybody that you're the kind of leader who rewards people for coming up with the right answer, the right solution. And the next time you have a meeting, everybody's going to be looking at you as they speak, and they're going to be waiting to see if you're nodding along, and they're not going to want to say anything that they think is not going to end up being the way you end up moving forward. If you want to make sure people share their best arguments, if you want to make sure that people feel comfortable saying things, even though there's a chance, maybe even a good chance, that the idea will actually be rejected, if you want to make sure people say things when they disagree with the group, you want to make sure that when you end your meetings, you don't just pat people on the back because they came up with the right idea first. Rather, you want to make sure that when you end your meetings, you remind people about all of the good ideas that came up, all of the good arguments that were made, that perhaps ultimately were rejected, that perhaps ultimately did not weigh heavily in the decision that you formally announced as the way forward. When you are seen as a leader who at the end of every meeting points out all of the good arguments that were made, rather than just shining a light on the person who came up with what was closest to the right answer, you're much more likely to be someone who in the next meeting will have a much more productive discussion where people are willing and feel comfortable and safe sharing ideas where there is some risk that those ideas might not be the right one. Because only when people feel comfortable doing that are you going to solve the big, ugly, complex problems that you're dealing with and calling those meetings for in the first place. Good luck. And I want to share 5 ideas with you that will hopefully help you the next time you find yourself negotiating a deal or a dispute in the middle of a crisis. In my experience, leaders and negotiators who follow these 5 principles outperform those who either don't do these things or don't do them systematically enough. So what are the 5 things you want to keep in mind? First, get your team together. This is not the time to rely only on your intuition or your point of view. Bring together a team of people you trust, colleagues, coworkers, your management team, partners, who will give you their honest opinion even when they disagree with you, who might see things that you're not seeing, who have a different point of view on matters, or who have different expertise than you do. Bring the team together, no matter how limited the time, to resolve the crisis or to launch your strategy. Second, on the issue of time, buy yourself as much time as you can. Now, a crisis is defined as a limited amount of time to solve a really big problem. But even in those moments, you want to buy yourself as much additional time as you can to make decisions. You want to make sure that if you were going to send an email right now, you try to wait 15 minutes or an hour or two, revisit it before you send that email. If you were going to pull the trigger on a strategy tonight, see if you can buy yourself some time, sleep on it, revisit it in the morning, and then decide whether it still makes sense. That additional time can be invaluable. Sometimes your perspective changes. You reflect and you change your mind about what would be the best way forward during that time. Other times, new information comes up that you might decide changes the course of action you should be taking. You learn something new about the crisis that you're in, about the environment that you're in. So buying that additional time is extremely useful in a crisis situation. Third, zoom out. It is very easy in a crisis situation to start focusing narrowly on what happens tomorrow and to focus narrowly on the stakeholders who are being loudest and whose demands are most pressing. You want to zoom out on both of these dimensions. Don't just think about how to get through the day today and how to get to tomorrow. To the extent possible, think about a month from now, a year from now, and 10 years from now, and see if you can try to optimize for your interests in the longer term, given the constraints of the crisis. The same thing is true when it comes to stakeholders. Too often in a crisis situation, we're only paying attention to the people who are loudest. We're only paying attention to the people who are making their demands most known to you in the here and now. What you want to do as a leader or a negotiator is to step back and Take inventory of all the stakeholders and what their needs are and what their interests are today and going into the future. And try again to optimize for that portfolio of stakeholders to the extent that you can, to the extent that is appropriate given the constraints of the situation you find yourself in. So first, get your team together. Second, try to buy yourself some more time. Third, zoom out and make sure you're keeping an eye on all the stakeholders and make sure you're keeping an eye on a much longer time frame than just getting through the day. The fourth thing you want to do is to make sure in a crisis that you take time to audit your strengths. It's very easy to get bogged down with the problems that you're dealing with, to get cynical, to get pessimistic, to start worrying and get anxious and think about all the things that can go wrong in the negotiation or that can go wrong in the strategy. But no matter how bad the situation is, you likely have some assets that you can leverage in the negotiation. You likely have some sources of leverage, and too often negotiators, especially in a crisis situation, lose sight of that. You want to make sure you audit and inventory what are the strengths that you bring to the table. What are sources of leverage that you could rely on to get a better deal or to get a better outcome? And fifth, now is the time for you to use your mission and your organization's values as a filter for making the decisions that you need to make that are really difficult. A crisis situation is when your mission statement and your value statement and your vision statement really pay dividends. Most of the time, these things just sit on a website or they just sit on a plaque on the wall. In a crisis situation, leaders and negotiators who use their mission statement as a way to filter what they will and will not do, who use their values to decide what they will or will not do, which strategy is or is not appropriate, end up negotiating and strategizing in a way that they can look back on once the smoke clears, once the crisis is over, once they've weathered the storm. They can look back and they can say, despite the problems that they ran into, despite the crisis that they encountered, they were able to navigate it in a way that was consistent with their mission and consistent with their values. Leaders and negotiators that do these 5 things, they get their team together, they buy themselves some time, they zoom out, they make sure they audit their strengths, and they make sure that they use their mission and the values of their organization as a filter for making hard decisions, end up negotiating much more effectively in a crisis. Good luck. In this video, I want to talk about the comparison between negotiation and chess, and 5 important ways in which negotiation is not like the game of chess. And the reason I bring this up is because often people think of negotiation as a game, and they'll often liken it to something like poker or chess. And it's a perfectly fine metaphor or analogy, unless you take it too seriously. Because if you start treating your negotiations like a game of chess, you're going to make some fundamental mistakes. Here are 5 ways in which negotiation is not like chess. First of all, chess is a zero-sum game. Whatever is good for them, by definition, is bad for you. They win equals you lost. That is not necessarily the case in most of the negotiations you participate in. There are ways for both of you to benefit. There are ways in which to create value together. There's benefits to cooperation and not just competing. So if you treat every negotiation like a game of chess and adopt a zero-sum mindset, you're probably going to end up losing opportunities for creating and capturing value. The second way in which the game of chess is very different from negotiations is that in a game of chess, the other side knows what its goals are. They know what they're optimizing for. They're trying to take out your pieces and they're trying to eventually capture your king. That's not how it works in negotiations. You can't assume that even they themselves truly know what their objectives are, what they should be optimizing for. A lot of that will depend a little bit on how you actually engage with them. They themselves may not be sure whether they want to collaborate with you or compete with you. They may not be sure what they should be pushing for and where they should be a little bit more flexible. So unlike in a game of chess, you can't walk in assuming that you know what they want or that even they know exactly what they want. Their interests, their own incentives may themselves be endogenous to the negotiation itself. They may evolve as the game continues. The third way in which negotiation is very different from the game of chess is that in a game of chess, we often assign point values to different assets. A pawn is worth 1 point, a bishop is worth 3, a rook might be worth 5. And regardless of the game you're playing, more or less these relative values stay constant. Certainly they can change a little bit depending on the kind of player you're playing against, but these are largely consistent across games. Rooks are just that much more important than pawns. Queens are even more important. That's not how it works in negotiation. The assets that you have, the assets that you may have leveraged in your previous negotiation, may be worth much less now or much more now in this negotiation with this other party. Whether it's limited time, whether it's your alternative offers, whether it's your reputation, whether it's that you control the process or you control the frame of the negotiation. These things can be much more or much less important across different negotiations. So it's incumbent upon you to really audit the value of the assets that you have and what is and isn't going to be of leverage in this particular negotiation. The fourth way in which chess and negotiation are very different. In the game of chess, all the action is at the table. The parties are there, and their moves and your moves determine the outcome. In a negotiation, you need to keep an eye on the entire negotiation space, which is just my way of saying all the parties that are relevant to the negotiation, whether they're at the table or not. And so success or failure in the, quote, game of negotiation may depend a lot more on parties that aren't even there, obviously playing the game, but are somehow influencing the negotiation anyway. So you need to broaden your view and broaden your scope and zoom out a little bit to make sure that you do well in this game of negotiation by keeping an eye on all the parties that can influence this game but aren't sitting across the table from you. And finally, the way in which negotiation and chess differ. If you take a break from a game of chess and go grab some lunch and come back, the board should look pretty much the way it did when you were sitting down previously. If you take a 5-minute break and you come back, you don't expect the pieces to have moved unless the other party came in and started to cheat. That's not how it works in negotiation. As time goes on, the pieces in the game of negotiation can move on their own. When you come back, when time goes on, as a negotiation drags on, the conditions themselves might change. The setup might change. Your leverage or your strength or weaknesses may change. So as a negotiation goes forward in time, and if it's not happening all in one sitting, you need to make sure that every so often you reconsider and audit once again. What are the interests of all sides? What leverage do we have? What are the constraints that each side has? Are people's perspectives changing? Because if you don't, and you assume that things stay where they were when you last left off, you might miss important opportunities or might get hurt or have negative consequences because you missed things that have changed to your detriment. So if you think of the negotiation as being different from chess in those 5 ways, you're going to be a much more effective negotiator and maybe even a much more effective chess player. And again, those 5 things are: 1, negotiation, unlike chess, is not a zero-sum game. 2, the goals of the other side may not be clear to you and they may not be clear to them either. 3, the value of the assets may change in negotiation in ways that they don't change as much in the game of chess. So you need to audit again, what are your sources of leverage and how might they differ this time versus in the last negotiation you participated in. 4th, there's a lot of action away from the table in a game of negotiation, which doesn't happen in the game of chess. And finally, as time moves forward, even if you're not playing the game, your negotiation might be changing in ways that you need to be aware of. Whereas in a game of chess, things usually stay the same when you walk away and come back to the board. Good luck in your future negotiations. So I want to talk about the last goal you should have in every negotiation, no matter how much you've failed to achieve your other objectives. So here's what I have in mind. You're going to walk into a situation which was pretty desperate to begin with, where the odds of success were pretty low. Maybe there's a lot of hostility between the two sides. Maybe there's a lot of mistrust. Maybe it's just going to be a very complex deal to make work out. You walk in, you try to achieve a deal that both sides can live with, doesn't work out. You're trying to improve a relationship, the relationship is still bad. You're trying to resolve a dispute, the dispute is no better just because you negotiated. So it looks like you failed in every one of your objectives. But there is one other goal you should have had in mind, which I think negotiators should always have as one of the things they're trying to accomplish, no matter how bad the situation is when they walk into the room. And that objective, that goal, is to make sure that when the negotiation is over, regardless of what happened in the negotiation, the other side can say the following thing about you. You want the other side to be able to say after the negotiation is over, you know what? We didn't get a deal. We didn't really make much progress. I got to be honest, I still don't trust them any more than I did before. But I will say one thing. I can respect them for the way they handled the situation. I respect them for the way in which they approached the negotiation. That's what you're going for in every negotiation, regardless of whether or not you achieve a deal or you achieve your other objectives, such as resolving a relationship conflict or some other kind of dispute. You always want to make sure that the other side can walk away saying about you, you know what? Things didn't quite work out. I'm not sure we're any farther along. I'm not sure I even like this person, but I can say one thing. I can respect them for the way they handled the situation. Now, why is that so important? That one word, respect, when that exists in a relationship, even when all else fails, it leaves the door open for future engagement. They may not like what you want, they may not like your proposals, they may not like your point of view on the situation, but if they feel that they can respect the way in which you're handling the situation from your point of view, they're much more likely to engage in the future. And what failed today might one day succeed. And you get that respect when you make sure in those negotiations, the difficult negotiations, the really ugly conflicts, you keep your cool, you stand by your word. If you say you're going to do something, you follow through, you don't make false promises, you listen, you try to understand their point of view, you don't fight for things that are not that important for you, but you stand firm on the things that are important to you and you explain why you're doing it. When you do those things in a negotiation, you may not achieve the outcome you hoped to get, but you may have laid the groundwork for a future negotiation in which problems can be solved or improved. Always making sure that one of your goals is to have the other side walk away saying, maybe I don't like them, maybe I don't like where this negotiation went, but I can respect them. That is success. Good luck. In this clip, I want to talk about something that I think all great negotiators really prioritize in their negotiations, and that is credibility. Truly effective negotiators that I've met in all walks of life, diplomats, business negotiators, even people that you run into in relational contexts, the most effective negotiators will guard their credibility with their life. If they say they're going to do something, they follow through. If they don't think they're going to be able to do something, they don't make promises. Why is this so important? If you stick around long enough and you do some really interesting and big negotiations or engage in really important disputes that you're trying to resolve, if you stick around long enough, you're going to one day come to a negotiation where the only leverage you have in that deal, the only leverage you have in that dispute is your credibility. It's going to be the only reason the other side even sits down at the table to talk to you. It's going to be the only reason they're going to agree to take the risks you might be asking them to take. And on that day, you are going to be really glad you did not allow your credibility to just dissipate over the years that you were negotiating in the past. Because that's usually how it happens. It's rarely the case that somebody loses their credibility, loses their reputation because they did one really bad thing. Now, of course, we can think of people like that. They usually make it into the newspapers. But most people don't lose their credibility. They don't lose their reputation by doing one really major thing that everybody heard about that was very bad. Rather, most people lose their credibility a little at a time. They make deals, they make promises, they say things, they don't always follow through on them. When things are a little costly, they cut corners. When things are a little inconvenient, they do things that might rub people the wrong way, but hey, it was worth it because it helped them out. Now, that seems to make a lot of sense, day by day, minute by minute, deal by deal. But at the end of all of that, you end up being one of those people that has very little credibility. And think about it in your own organization, in your own industry, in your own country. The people that you know don't have that kind of credibility. In my experience, the reason truly effective negotiators guard their credibility with their life is because they've been in too many situations where their credibility is the greatest asset that they have. It is the greatest source of leverage that they have. So not only is it unethical to do things like break promises or make false promises or cheat or lie or steal, but it's also bad strategy. The reason effective negotiators guard their credibility with their life is because being credible, no matter how costly it is in the short run to maintain that credibility, actually does pay off if you play the game long enough. Good luck. In this video, I want to talk about giving advice. Now, a lot has been said and written about the topic of advice giving, and I want to focus on just one aspect of it, something that I've dealt with in my own experience. The situation I'm thinking about is, you have a colleague or a boss or somebody who reports to you coming to you with a problem, seeking advice, maybe strategic advice. Maybe they're stuck, maybe they're in a deadlock of some kind, and they're looking for a way out. Or maybe you're in a more formal advisory role and your clients come to you seeking advice. What I find is that too often when somebody asks for advice, they give you too little information before they ask you to weigh in. Don't fall for that trap. Now, I don't mean to imply that they do this on purpose, but what often ends up happening is if you have a 30-minute meeting set aside, too often the person asking for advice will give you 5 minutes of background and then ask you for suggestions. And in the past, I would often launch into, well, here's what I would do, maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes into that meeting. And I found out that it didn't go well. Too often, the response from the other side was one of the following. Either they would say, well, I've already tried that, it didn't work. Or they might say, well, that could never work because, and then they would give me additional information that they just hadn't provided before. That certainly does make the idea not a particularly good one. So, what did I learn? First, don't launch into advice giving too soon. If there's 30 minutes to have that discussion, I wait not just 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, but at least 20 minutes before I even think about giving advice. In the meantime, what I'm doing is extracting as much information as I can about their situation, asking many more follow-ups, because I don't understand the situation as finely as they do. Second, when I do give advice, I don't frame it as, here's what I would do, or here's what I think you should do. Rather, I frame it as a question. What do you think would happen if you did the following? Now, when you ask the question, what do you think would happen if you did the following? It does two things. First, it conveys your proposal, but it also inoculates you. It also makes it clear that you're not presuming that they haven't already tried this idea. So if their reaction was going to be, oh, well, we tried that, and then the conversation becomes about the learnings from what happens when you use that approach. So instead of proposing, here's what you should do, if you get into the habit of saying, what do you think would happen if you did the following? Or why wouldn't we want to do it this way? What it allows is simultaneously for you to give advice, but also extract more information about the situation that they might not have given you. And at the end of all of that, it ends up being a much more productive conversation where the reason they came to you in the first place to get good advice is actually much more likely to be fulfilled, and you maintain more of your credibility. Good luck. Hi, my name is Deepak Malhotra, and I'm a professor of negotiations at Harvard Business School. I'm also co-author of the book, Negotiation Genius, and author of the book, Negotiating the Impossible. In this series of videos, I'm talking about the topic of negotiation, and in each video, I talk about one key idea, an insight, a principle, a tactic, or an approach that will hopefully help you as you navigate your own deals and disputes. In this video, I want to talk about walking away from the table. Now, there's lots of reasons one might walk away from a negotiation. Let's consider the following situation. You've made a proposal, you think it's a pretty good one, but the other side is rejecting your offer. Now, maybe they think they can get a better deal elsewhere, but you're pretty sure they can't. Or perhaps they can, but you're unwilling to go any higher in your proposal. So what do? You're ready to walk away. In this video, I want to talk about walking away from the table. Now, there's lots of reasons one might walk away from a negotiation. Let's consider the following situation. You've made a proposal, you think it's a pretty good one, but the other side is rejecting your offer. Now, maybe they think they can get a better deal elsewhere, but you're pretty sure they can't. Or perhaps they can, but you're unwilling to go any higher in your proposal. So what do? You're ready to walk away because you've exhausted all means of trying to influence them or persuade them that this is the deal they should take. 4 things to keep in mind before you walk away. First, always make sure that you have justified your offer, explained why it's appropriate, explained why it's legitimate, and made sure the value proposition is clear. Second, acknowledge that they're not at a point where they're willing to say yes, and that's okay. If you think you can get a better deal elsewhere, I encourage you to shop around. And I hope once you get a better sense of the market, you'll come back and we'll be able to have a further discussion. Third, make sure you agree upon a process for when you're going to re-engage with the other party. Think about what happens if they walk away and they're shopping around and now they feel like they're not getting a better deal anywhere else and they have to make it back to the table with you. Are they going to feel comfortable doing that? Or are they going to feel like they're going to come back and feel kind of sheepish that they shopped around and here they are again? It makes it a lot easier for them if you've agreed upon a process that says something like, why don't we talk again in 1 week? I'll give you a call on Tuesday and we can think a little bit about where things are in the process for you, and perhaps we can have a meeting then and see if we can take this forward. That makes it easier for them to make their way back to the table rather than feel like they're going to look desperate or weak if they come back. Which comes to the 4th point. Always give them a face-saving way to return to the table. Part of that is agreeing upon a process up front. Part of it might be to include some language in your negotiation that says something like, you know what? If I was in your situation, I'd probably do the same thing. I'd want to make sure I'm getting the best deal I can. So I probably would shop it around a little bit. And then I'd come back and I'd feel much more confident that if I'm going to say yes, it's to a great deal. That makes it easier for the other side to come back later on without looking like they've lost face. So if you do all 4 of those things, you make sure your value proposition is clear and you've justified your proposal and explained why it's appropriate. If you've acknowledged their concerns and their reasons for walking away and said that that's okay, if you've given them a process and agreed upon a process for how you're going to re-engage with them, and you've given them a face-saving way of coming back to the table, there's a much higher likelihood that this deal will eventually get done if you're the right partners. Good luck. In this video, I want to talk about a specific kind of hardball tactic, the last-minute demand. You've negotiated a deal, it's gone on for a long time, you think it's ready to be signed, and all of a sudden the other side throws out just one more demand. What to do about it? Well, I'm reminded of a story that a former student of mine who ran his own business told me once. He was in the business of real estate development, and he was working on a commercial development project. And after about 9 months of negotiating a pretty important deal, a deal that was going to make or break his year, on the very last day, his client, before signing the deal, said, wait a second, there's just one more thing we need to change. And the demand he made regarded the penalty clause for any delays in construction. Now, in fairness, the two sides had already discussed the issue, and they'd already come up with a penalty clause. The language is already in the contract. What the other side was demanding on this last day was a huge increase, something like a 10 times larger penalty in case there were delays in construction. Now, my student was pretty turned off by this. He thought it was unfair, he thought it was unethical, he thought it was too aggressive. If this was an important issue, he should have brought it up earlier. And so my student told me that in that moment, he thought about his options. Very quickly, he came to the conclusion, I would love to walk away from this on principle, but I just can't afford to. The other side knows I'm too invested to walk away at this point. Too much is riding on this deal for me. And he's right, I can't just walk away, which made him even more upset. So the idea of walking away on principle was crossed off the list. And then he said, I had 2 options. I could just accept the new proposal and do my best not to be delayed, or I could try to haggle a little bit and try to meet somewhere in the middle, maybe between what we had originally agreed to and this new number. He said he was about to do that when it occurred to him something we had talked about in class many years ago. He said, it occurred to me, thinking back to your class on negotiations, what you would advise to do in that moment is to, instead of just responding to this new proposal or reacting to this new proposal, look for more information. Seek to better understand what's really going on here. And he said, I thought about that for a moment, and it occurred to me that I actually might have a third option. I said to myself, the student told me, I said to myself, you know what, maybe it's not right that he made this demand on the last day, that he waited till he knew I was desperate before he sprung this on me. But if I think about it, in this moment, he could have asked for anything. If he was going to wait till I was desperate and make a demand, he could have asked for a lower price. He could have asked for some other terms. Why did he choose this particular demand to put into the contract? The one thing I can definitely deduce from this, he said, is that a delay is clearly something this buyer does not want to have to deal with. He could have asked for anything. He's asking for a higher penalty in case of a delay. So now I know not having a larger delay is a huge issue for this person. So he said, my response to him was, listen, I don't think it's particularly appropriate on the last day to reopen one issue in a very complex negotiation. I think this is something we've discussed before, and I think we came to a good understanding. But I'll tell you what, if this is really important to you, I'm willing to engage. If this is something that matters a lot to you, I don't want to dismiss it out of hand. If my client brings something up, I want to make sure that I understand what the problem is, and I always want to make sure the person is satisfied. So from my point of view, we need to balance these two things. Is it reasonable to bring this up on the last day? Probably not. On the other hand, do you have some legitimate concerns? And if so, let's make sure those are handled. As the conversation continued, the proposal he made was the following. He said, I figured if he doesn't want to delay, it's also possible that the sooner this development gets finished, the better off he's going to be. So the proposal he ended up making to the other side was the following. He said, I will agree to a higher penalty if there's a delay, if in exchange you will increase the price you pay to me, if I can get this project done sooner than the deadline we had agreed to, while still meeting all of the specs and all of the quality standards. They discussed the proposal a little bit more, and that's what they agreed to. On the one side, the penalty would be higher. On the other side, there would be a reward, an incentive to finish the development even sooner. And actually, both sides were better off having had that discussion and revising the contract. Now, that's clearly not what the other side had wanted when he made that proposal. He was just trying to get a better deal for himself. So he made that demand. But what effective negotiators do is they interpret every demand as an opportunity. Everything the other side demands of you is an opportunity, clearly, for you to create value for them. But if you're in a position to create value for the other side, that's a good thing. If you can create value for the other side, you might be able to monetize the value you create for the other side and get paid for doing so. So if we think about what happened in this story, there was already a deal. The other side started making additional demands. Our side thought about it and said, wait, if they're making more demands, clearly there's something I can do that's of value to them. Now let's see if we can find a way to give them what they want in exchange for something that we also want. If you start getting into the habit of not being annoyed or frustrated when the other side makes demands of you, but instead recognizing that when the other side makes demands, it's good news. It tells you that you are bringing some value to the table or could bring some additional value to the table. By interpreting demands as opportunities, you're much more likely to create more value and capture a piece of it for yourself. Good luck.